All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to Idealism Forever, where materialists are big mad because today we're going to be taking out something very important to a lot of them, which is this denial of free will. So, a lot of materialists deny free will. And a lot of the times I've noticed it's on the basis of their materialism. There are other philosophical arguments against materialism and all that, or I mean, against free will. But I've noticed in particular, a lot of them tend to embrace this scientism and materialism, and that's where they get this idea that we don't have free will. And if you're not familiar with Robert Sapolsky, he's the guy I'm going to be primarily responding to. Robert Sapolsky is a professor at Stanford University, and he recently wrote a book arguing that he believes science tells us we don't have free will. And he's going to be talking to another scientist, Lawrence Krauss, about this. And he's a physicist. So it's two materialistic scientists arguing that we don't have free will. And I'm going to be rebutting them today. But before I get into that as well, I also want to say I'm not even like a big free will guy. I believe in free will, but I don't really get too defensive about it. I don't really get into the weeds on it. There's this one guy, Christian Idealism, that I know. He really knows the literature on free will versus those who deny free will and all that. And so yeah, I know there's a whole world there to explore. But I'm not even really about that today. I'm not like trying to defend free will per se. I'm really going to be undermining their denial of free will by showing where their materialism fails. And by doing that, they don't really have much of a basis for denying free will. So I guess with that little intro out of the way, let's go ahead and get to the clips here. So we got a video with Robert Sapolsky and Lawrence Krauss. And so, yeah, I already got the first timestamp lined up here. Let's see what Sapolsky has to say.
And, during one sort of particularly agitated period, I woke up at 2 a.m. one night and said, "Oh, I get it. God doesn't exist. What's going on?" And then shortly after that was, "Oh, and there's no free will." And that was followed by, "And it's a totally empty, indifferent universe." So that cured everything, right?
Okay, yeah, and so that's Robert Sapolsky right there. The guy's obviously Krauss. And so he was like 13 years old or some kind of a young teenage years. And he has this epiphany, like in the middle of the night, that there's no God. And then after that, that's when he goes, oh, soon after, there's no free will as well. And this actually makes a lot of sense. I won't pull up the study, but if you go to Phil Papers, they have a survey that they do of what philosophers believe. And you can see the correlations of what philosophers believe. And a lot of those who do believe in God tend to believe in free will. And those who, on the contrary, if they don't believe in God, tend to not believe in free will. So there's a sense in which, how much of this is guided by his theology? How much of this is guided, or his atheology, you could say? How much of it is his atheistic materialistic view that's really guiding him to this idea that there's no free will, as opposed to science telling us there's no free will? Because that's the point they want to try to say here, that the science leads us to believe there's no free will. But I don't think so. I think that's just their materialism that they're reading into science. So I just thought that was very telling for him to say that it starts with atheism for him, then to denying free will. So let's go to the next timestamp here. All right, this is close enough.
Read it, because how do you do that? Science just seemed like the only intellectually sustainable default state to try to understand things, but it sure does not give comfort.
Yeah, so the context for before that isn't too necessary. The thing I wanted to quote there to really bring up is that he's talking about how science, this seems to be the default way to understand the world. This seems to be the main way to understand things, and this is a form of scientism. And I've gone off on scientism before. A quick point to note is that it's in many ways self-defeating, because how would you even know scientism is true? through science? Would science tell you that science is the default or only or best way to know things? I think that's circular. I don't think that really works. So I think you're going to need more than just science. And and I think by limiting yourself to science, you're really setting up the board in a very bad way because science, as I take it, really only studies the structure and the dynamics, the behavior of what it is we're observing. And so if you limit your worldview to just that, all you're only seeing behavior, well then yeah, of course I can see why you might think in such deterministic ways because you're not even getting at what's intrinsic. You're not getting at what drives the behavior. You're just seeing behavior. And so, of course, if you're looking through this deliberately limited scope of science and saying, well, I'm just seeing a bunch of behavior, so it's like behaviorism. It's like, well, yeah, of course, you're only looking at through a very narrow scope. So I'll have a bit more to say on that, but I think there's a second timestamp where he kind of says this again, or maybe it's Lawrence Krauss who goes into this. So we'll go to this timestamp here.
Summarize, in order to prove there's free will, we have to show that some behavior just happened out of thin air in the sense of considering all of these biological precursors, the ones we've talked about and a lot more, obviously, in the book. It may be possible to sidestep that with some subtle philosophical arguments, but you can't with anything known to science. And I think that's the sort of the key thing.
Yeah, and see, and there we go. See, they keep trying to load the dice in a way to rig the game by saying that, well, if you can come up with something, it can't be outside of science. Because if you do that, as they'll mention later, oh, you must be talking about fairy dust. You must be talking about some magic stuff, as if there's nothing outside the domain of science, which is ridiculous, as I pretty much already explained, because science is a limited scope. It only studies the behavior, the dynamics, the structure. And there's more to reality than just behavior. There are things that behave. So if you want to get at the thing, the actual entity, that's when you start getting at metaphysics. And that's something physics doesn't do. So, and metaphysics has everything to do with what we're talking about right now. The existence of free will is a metaphysical topic. So to say, no, 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 you can't get into metaphysics is kind of interesting because it's like, well, that's exactly what we're talking about. If you can only do physics, then of course, oh no, we can't bring in these great, metaphysical arguments that make our point because nope, that's not scientific. So it's just scientific thinking that is really a category error. And so I think this scientism is really driving their materialism, and this scientism is really driving why they come to this conclusion that there's no free will. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about their materialism right here. I got some more timestamps for you guys. We're going to be jumping all over the place here too. So 144 should be 26, close enough.
And that's a good thing because it has instrumental value, not because it has moral value. But it's this huge dichotomy that the natural attributes we have are made out of atoms. And whether you show backbone in a moment of temptation, that's the stuff that's made out of the fairy dust. And what you do with what you got, what you do with those crossroads and splits in the road and all those things is made of the same stuff because it's that frontal cortex of yours that decides, are you going to show impulse control? Are you going to do long-term planning? And it's the exact same. How did you get the frontal cortex that you have?
Okay, see, I think that's enough there. Yeah, so notice how he's getting at this point that, well, everything's just made of atoms, including the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex and everything else has to behave in these law-like mechanistic ways that we see in physics. So if that's all there is just a bunch of atoms and stuff, well, then anything more must just be fairy dust, is what they're suggesting. There must be more. There has to be this dualism there. And as an idealist, I'm able to completely turn the tables on them. I don't need to say there's atoms plus this extra stuff that's like fairy dust. Really, we can just say there's just will. There's just consciousness. And so atoms, what you call atoms, really is just an experience in the mind. And So you don't really need to say it's anything more, anything different in kind than the mind. So there's really no need for any such fairy dust. There's just what we know most intimately: consciousness, our will, all that. So there's really, no need for this. And again, as you can see, it's a big driving force there, is this assumption that it's all a bunch of atoms. And if you start from there, it's hard to get away from this deterministic view that denies free will. So it all goes back to that metaphysical starting point. And listen to how he talked earlier about the prefrontal cortex. He says the prefrontal cortex decides to do certain things. Now, maybe I'm being a bit, picky, but I've seen a lot of these materialistic types talk about the brain in these mentalistic ways. They give mental predication to the brain as if it is a thinking thing. In one instance, they want to act like it's just a mindless mechanical machine that's just operating on the laws of physics, and then the next, they say the brain decides to do such and such. That doesn't really sound like very mechanistic, atomistic forces at hand. So they kind of slip in this mentalistic language to sort of make sense of what's going on. And if he really tried to get away from that, if he really tried to strip himself of all that mental predication, no, you won't end up with very much. You'll end up with a bunch of levers and pulleys and stuff like that, but you won't be able to make much sense of human behavior like that. So we're going to go to the next timestamp here, which isn't too far away from this one.
Clear is that fundamentally everything is determined by a combination of nature, which is biology, physics, and chemistry, and none of those have fairy dust in them.
Yeah, see, there you go again with the fairy dust. So yeah, again, as we said earlier, physics, chemistry, biology, these are just scientific studies, and they are just scientific studies about just the behaviors of what we observe. What are the entities that we talk about when we're talking about, in physics and biology and chemistry and stuff like that? Well, that's a question for metaphysics. And that's not a matter of fairy dust or anything extra. That's just reality. Because again, science is a limited scope. Science is only describing the behaviors. So if we're going to go, okay, well, enough about behavior, let's talk about what's intrinsic to that behavior. Let's talk about what drives that behavior. What is the entity that is doing the behavior? That's when we have to go to metaphysics. And that's when the idealist is going to capitalize, because all they have is scientism so far. They just keep going science. But rightfully, the idealist can say that's not metaphysics. You're not actually providing us with anything intrinsic about what's real. The idealist can say, we know there's consciousness, we know there's experience, so let's go from there. And they can say all they want, but physics and chemistry. The idealist is just going to go, yeah, physics and chemistry, I agree. Things behave. There's structure, there's dynamics. But at no point does that commit me to materialism or that we are made of atoms or any of that stuff. So, yeah, I really think that this is just, they're thinking that they can just hide behind this scientism and that will do the heavy lifting for them. But as soon as you really identify what science is, it just doesn't do what they want it to do. It's a very hollow materialism. Here we go. Here's the next one.
About consciousness, to the same argument as where is the you that exists beyond your brain? I mean, it's the same really argument, isn't it? In some sense, it's where can that be? If this is what there is, so where's the you if it's not there?
Yeah, see, and again, so there's this assumption that, well, the identity theory of materialism says that, like, what we call mind, or consciousness, or self, whatever language you want to use there, it just is the brain. And he's saying, well, if it's not just the brain, it's got to be something extra. There's this extra stuff. There's the brain, and then there's the extra mystery consciousness stuff or fairy dust stuff. But actually, once again, the idealist can turn the tables, because what we actually know first and foremost is our first person subjective awareness. It's the fact that there is consciousness. So really what you could say is that's what we know to be real. And this idea of a brain, that's an experience in the mind. The brain is real, not saying it isn't, but what you really know to be real is the self. It's the I. It's the fact that you're having experiences. You can start from there. In fact, that's where you're supposed to start because that's what you actually know first and foremost. And so, this idea of the brain being what you know most and foremost, and that, well, if there's something else, it's got to be fairy dust, completely mistaken. So, completely backwards. You only know about the existence of a brain because of your experiences. You wouldn't know about a brain if it wasn't for a you there that sees something like a brain. And then you come to this philosophical belief that, oh, well, that must be me. But I think that's just based off of a very flawed logic, as I've already gone over. So I think I've said enough on that point. I think he has one more thing he wants to say about the identity theory, which I thought was pretty interesting. A lot of materialistic assumptions going on here.
The separation between our brain and the we. You want to elaborate on that a little bit in your perspective of that?
Yeah, and it's totally false. And just to show sort of the pedigree that comes with, like, arguably the most influential compatibilist philosopher on earth right now, talks about exactly that model with a possibility generator, an idea generator.
Okay, yeah, so that part I don't need. But yeah, so he wants to just say, like, oh yeah, it's just obviously true that identity theory is true. It's just obviously true that we just are the brain. But I don't think it actually is actually very obvious. In fact, as an idealist, I think it's obvious that you're a self, you're a subject of consciousness, and everything else you're seeing is really just an experience. And there's really no need to assume, well, I am the brain. I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, Sam Harris made this point. If you introspect, you look within, do you see a bunch of neurons firing, a bunch of chemicals going off? No, there's feelings, there's the self, there's you and your experiences, but that's it. I'm not seeing anything like a chemical reaction going off inside my skull. When you really think about it, that's just a philosophical idea of materialism, this notion that I am the brain. That's not obviously true at all. That's like working backwards. So disappointing. And I know he's a scientist. He's not the most philosophical guy, but he is talking about something philosophical here. And I think we have every right to correct him when he makes a mistake there. Okay. So I think this is another Krauss timestamp here. What's Lawrence Krauss got to say?
Why is right now, is there so much here to just say two things? There's no uncaused decision making. No decision is made by some magical thing. It's always caused by a series of causes, which then have causes, which then, as you say at the beginning of the book, turtles all the way down.
Yeah, well, you could say, for instance, that let's say you believe in free will and you agree with that. You say, yeah, everything's caused by something. Well, they could just say something like, well, I believe in agent causation. Yeah, my behavior is caused by something, but it's caused by agent causation. So that's what's happening here. This argument that they're saying that, well, everything has a cause, even the free will guy is going to say, yeah, okay, there's a cause. And that's me. I'm that cause. And it's like, even if there was a prior cause to me, that doesn't mean I'm not causing something. So I'm just not sure where they're going to go from there, quite frankly. And this idea that there is no uncaused decision, this is definitely a more abstract way to look at it. But if you are an idealist and you're like a priority monist who thinks there's a fundamental reality, a fundamental mind, you could say, yeah, I mean, this mind is uncaused. It's fundamental. And it does cause some things to happen. It does make some decisions. And there is no prior cause to those decisions. And that's conceivable. There's nothing illogical about that. So just the sentence, there is no uncaused cause or something like that with decisions and all of that. It is conceivable to see that wrong. especially if you're as an idealist. But yeah, I really think the point about agent causation, you can call it agent determination or self-determination. There's many different ways people talk about it. But yeah, I think that really kind of gets around their point there. And I don't know if he said it yet in the clip. Let me see if he does say it. Hold on.
And the second is that if that's the case, then the notion of responsibility for your decision making, if there's no spontaneous decision making, if there's no free will, if everything is based on some physical, biological, chemical process, then we have to renounce, or at least rethink what we mean by taking responsibility for our actions.
Okay, yeah. So again, just a reminder, notice how he again repeats that, well, if there's this biological, physical basis. And again, I think we have good reasons to believe, nope, that's not how it works. That's not true. And so we can just negate that premise right there. But even so, he says, well, if there's no free will and stuff like that, there's no responsibility. And I get the point there. Yeah, if we don't have free will, perhaps you could say there's no responsibility. But then again, I think as someone who does believe in free will, and as even they're going to say too, the common sense view is that there is responsibility, that we can't really live as if there is no responsibility. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but Sapolsky on the left here, he has gone to court cases as an expert witness and tried to argue before that no, these people don't deserve punishment because that it's outside of their control. And I get the merciful perspective behind that, but I think the basis of why they come to that conclusion is this flawed physicalism and scientism. And once you get away with that, now you can see the horrors of such a view. You can see that if you have no responsibility, and like you're just going to be letting murderers get away. You're just going to be enabling people doing horrible things and and hurting people, really. And they're just going to excuse it by saying, "Oh, it's just my brain, bro. It's just it's physics made me do it, bro." And what are you going to do? You're just going to shrug your shoulders and say, "Oh, well, I guess that's that." And then there's no justice, really. And I know how he thinks there would be justice and under his worldview, but again, that's based on his metaphysics. And once you remove the metaphysics, you remove that implication. And yeah, you can see how horrible it would be to have no responsibility. So, okay, I think they have another point that they're going to make about causeless causes, which I may not even need to address because I kind of already said something about that. But let's see what they have to say.
And when people claim that there are causeless causes of your behavior that they call free will, they have A, failed to recognize or not learned about the determinism lurking beneath the surface, and or B, erroneously concluded that the rarefied aspects of the universe that do work indeterministically can explain your character, morals, and behavior.
Yeah, so again, yeah, I guess that was kind of unnecessary, but yeah, he's just again repeating this idea, and he's reading from the book, Sapolsky's book, that if you're believing in free will, you got to believe in these uncaused causes. And again, that's just not true. They believe in agent causation. They believe even if they believe in determinism, they can believe in a self-determination that you can determine yourself, and you can cause yourself to behave in certain ways. So. I don't know. I guess that point's already been addressed. But this next part I'm going to bring up here is ironic because as much as you heard, particularly Krauss, I've cited a lot of Krauss more, but he's quoting Sapolsky here. He's reading from Sapolsky. Notice how they're saying, yeah, obviously there's no free will because obviously materialism is true. There's no responsibility. I'm going to go to court cases and, try to defend these guys. But I think the way Krauss responds here is intriguing.
I don't think we have a choice, ultimately, and I think that we should, I'm getting ahead of myself, but in some sense, part of the last part of the book is saying, well, how can we wanting there to be free will and believing their free will is so ingrained. How can we get over it? But I think we just recognize that not thinking in terms of free will is just part of the way we're wired too, and that's we don't have the choice to not emotionally want there to be free will.
And I think, don't you think that's telling, Krauss? Like when you really think about it, it's like prima facie, it really seems like we do have free will. On its face, if you're just going off of common sense, your average Joe and typical person, we believe that there's free will. It really feels like it. And we're not going to not believe in it until there's a good reason to do so. You need an actual sufficient reason. And so far, they haven't done so. And so it's just so interesting to see them cope, because it is a cope. He's like, well, maybe free will isn't real, but like I can't help but believe it. I got to still live that way. I don't have a choice. That's what it is. I believe in it still because I don't have a choice. It's because of determinism. And I think what you're experiencing really is just cognitive dissonance. You're experiencing the absurdity of not believing in free will, because it's ridiculous. If you really try to live it out, you can't do it. This idea of, oh, no one's responsible for anything at all. I mean, some things I can see us not being fully responsible for. Okay, if someone's, was abused growing up, now they have this mental illness, and now they, behave in these crazy ways. It's, I can conceive of that. I don't think that person lacks free will, though. They still have free will, but I can see how their will has been afflicted. And so maybe it's harder for them to exercise it freely, but they still have it, and there's still responsibility. And even someone like yourself, Krauss, and Sapolsky, who says there isn't free will, you can't help but think otherwise. You can't help but have that natural human impulse. And I think to try to deny that is just to live in denial. You're just going up against what is true, because you're trying to stay faithful to this scientism and this materialism. But if you just drop the scientism and materialism, you're free to just be yourself. No pun intended there. You're free to just believe in free will. Okay. I think he does go on a little bit more here, yeah, because he said he was getting ahead of himself. So he talks about it again a little bit later. Let's get back to it. That's too far. Oh, wait a minute.
Free will rather than doing exactly the opposite.
No, in fact, we're not in agreement, because I guess what I wanted to say is that appropriately, in fact, that's my out at the last part of this book. I'm going to argue that appropriately treating the world as if we have free will, understanding that we don't have free will allow the kind of positive change that is necessary, even personal positive change. We'll get there. The possibility of change and how you do it can only be effectively done when you understand the mechanisms that imply we don't have free will. If you want to understand how to affect, we talk about we don't have the ability to determine what we wish in some ways, but with that knowledge, we can, I think, allow future development that may change what we wish. So we'll get there. And I think that's really important. But
yeah, I don't know. It just sounds like a big cope to me. It's like, look, we're going to still believe we don't have free will, but we're going to still live as if we do have free will. And you could tell he just couldn't quite get the words out even. And even Sapolsky kind of this look on his face, like, I don't know where he's going with this. I don't know what's happening. But I know Sapolsky kind of agreed with him there. But earlier in the podcast, I don't have a clip here, but they talk about how he did go into court cases, and he actually tries to argue that no, we shouldn't really live as if we have free will. We shouldn't be throwing people in prison. We shouldn't be punishing people for things they're not responsible for. And Krauss is kind of contradicting that and saying that, well, no, we have to live as if that's the case, because he knows if you think it through, that's not okay. You're not going to be able to sustain a society like that. You're going to be enabling all sorts of wicked behavior. And so I don't know. I think, unless I'm misunderstanding Sapolsky, it looks like Sapolsky's being polite, because I think Sapolsky doesn't want us to live as if we have free will. He says, no, that's not merciful. That's like why should you praise somebody for something they didn't earn? Or why should you blame somebody for something that's not their fault? You know, if you really tried, if you convince society, if you, control the media and you convince everybody that there's no free will, do you really think the public is, not going to rebel when you try to punish them, Krauss? Like, if you were to try to, like, all right, well, we're going to still live as if we have free will. Let's send him to court. Let's put him in jail. Do you really think the people are just going to be like, okay? No, they're going to be like, you just told us I'm not responsible. You just said that. You said I'm not responsible. Now I am. So it's just not going to work, bro. Let's see. He has one more cope here. Again, similar to what we were getting at already, but just more nails in the coffin, you could say.
We're doing that. But it's the same as saying, the fact that evolution requires us in some sense to believe in free will is the same as saying, well, evolution may, in principle suggest, it's okay to, kill your neighbor under certain conditions, but we do have learning that allows us to override, at least intellectually override that fundamental evolutionary remnant. So I think the second half of your book, in large sense,
I don't know. I guess I don't have too much more to add to what I've already said, but it sounds like it's just a sophisticated way to gaslight ourselves. Let's just gaslight ourselves into not believing what's obviously true. So, okay, here's another interesting point where they talk a little bit about compatibilism, and this is a big issue for him because he even says that in his book, a lot of the time that he spent writing it is combating compatibilism. So let's see what he's going to have to say here. Oh, wait, you know what? I think I got the timestamp wrong here. Here we go. Right about there.
Very minority view. The most common one is that, it's a deterministic world. I'm not a Luddite, I'm not a whatever, yet there's like atoms and we're made of cells and like there's rules to the physical universe and stuff, but somehow that's compatible with us still having free will. And this compatibilism one is what I spend like most of the book tearing my hair out, because what the polls show is 95% of philosophers say that they are deterministic compatibilists. And like a shocking number of neuroscientists, when you really back them up in a corner and you try to get them to look at what it is that they just said or advocated. But it's this notion that, of course, like I'm a modern 21st century, all of that.
Yes.
And we're made of stuff and the universe has rules and all that. But somehow, there's room for this intangible thing to still be lurking in there. And that's the essence. That's the us of us.
Yeah. And so you see, again, I think why he says that, like at the very end, where he says, oh, well, it's got to be this intangible other stuff, right? Is like this presupposition of materialism and this idea that somehow physics, chemistry, biology, that is like exhaustive of the description of reality. And anything beyond that, that's got to be fairy stuff. That's got to be something else. But I guess I hate to repeat myself. We can just completely flip the script and say, no, it's the other way around. And when you do that, if you want to accept compatibilism with that perspective, I mean, it's so easy to see how free will makes sense of it, really. Like, especially when you have concepts like agent causation, self-determination. Like, yeah, you could say that everything is determined. You can combine that completely, but that does not contradict the idea that, okay, well then I'm going to determine myself, or the agent is going to cause things to happen. Just because things are determined, that's not the same thing as saying no free will. Those words don't mean the same thing. And I think that's partly why he's kind of pulling his hair out, because he thinks they do. Perhaps he thinks conceptually they must mean the same thing, especially when you look at it through the lens of materialism. But once you remove that lens, especially, I mean, come on. Oh, and by the way, someone in the chat asked a question. I'll get to the question at the end. If anybody else has any other questions or comments, by all means, please feel free to share them. If you have a question for me or something you want me to respond to, I'll get at that after my rant here about Sapolsky and Krauss. So yeah, like I don't know if I might be said to be a compatibilist, perhaps, because I'm okay with the idea that things are determined. I just don't see how that's contradicting the idea that there's free will. It's not obvious to someone like me. And I think Sapolsky needs to make it more clear that it's contradictory, that you can't have it. Okay, and this next timestamp, he's going to bring up a very popular experiment to the people who deny free will. This is a big one.
Like neurobiologists thinking about free will. And this is from this like landmark famous experiment in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet. And you read any damn paper on the biology, and by the second paragraph, out comes Libet, and you want to scream. Libet's the one who's done that study. That's the famous one. He sat people down and basically said, here, do this behavior, and do it whenever you feel like it. Press this button, and whenever you feel like it, and we're going to hook you up to all sorts of like modern ways to see what's going on in your brain and your muscles and all of that. And out of it came this incredible finding. So you put people in there and like you're monitoring what's happening in their brains when they decide to do something. And what they reported was at the moment that someone said, that's when I got the intention to press the button, you could already tell from their brain, like up to a few seconds before, that they had decided to push the button. Oh my God, everybody learned. Neuroscientists have just shown your brain knows before you do.
Yeah, again, there's that mentalistic language again. The brain knows before you. So I won't get too into that mentalistic language part. But yeah, I mean, this whole Libet experiment, okay, this has been addressed a lot, as he even kind of implied before. And people who deny free will want to, carry this around like, haha, we did it. We just proved free will. See? And quite frankly, this is quite easy to refute. There's been lots of counter arguments already said to this. A friend of mine, Christian Idealism, made a whole video about this, addressing the Libet experiments. It's called Neuroscience and Free Will by Christian Idealism. So if you're curious and you want more of a detailed refutation of his claims there, you can check that video out. But to briefly summarize, there's three big reasons why any argument against free will based on these experiments are going to fail. Okay, so this is from Christian Idealism. He says the readiness potential is present even when subjects are not making conscious choices, and therefore the readiness potential cannot be the cause of conscious decisions. 2. Researchers have identified a point of no return in self-initiated movement, which supports the interpretation that the mind has the ability to veto the readiness potential, so that the free will may take place in decision-making. 3. Maus, a researcher, has discovered that the readiness potential is absent when a subject makes a deliberate rather than arbitrary choice. The experiments in 2008 by Soon, another researcher, therefore cannot be counted as evidence against free will due to the fact that the subjects were making arbitrary rather than deliberate choices, and therefore any previous studies that involved arbitrary choices cannot be counted as evidence against free will. And so, again, I think this whole idea that the Libet or Libet experiments completely destroys free will, I think it's very overblown. I think they're missing a lot of fundamental philosophical points. And even that point about the readiness potential, I thought that was really interesting. I mean, that was there even before. So it's like, I just feel like they concluded too quickly on those experiments. I don't know. So shout out to Christian Idealism. He did a good job there. There's another timestamp I had for you guys, but I think I'm going to skip that one. That one's not that important. Let's go to right here.
There are means these days. One like standard one is this very cool thing, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you can stimulate a certain part of the brain and make somebody do something. Like, this is not suddenly make them become a libertarian when they weren't, but this is like you could make their index finger contract no matter what you try to do. And if it's done subtly enough, you will believe you decided to do that. I mean, I've had that done on me, and it's the weirdest thing imaginable. Or there's all sorts of ways of manipulating the Libet scenario.
Yeah, no point for the Libet part. So yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, you can make people move involuntarily. And like he even said, sure, it's in very, he had to qualify it a lot. In a very, if it's very subtle movement, you can kind of gaslight people into thinking they did it. But again, I'm just not really seeing what that's supposed to demonstrate. Like, yes, you can put strings on someone and pull on the string. Okay, yeah, and maybe you can gaslight them. You can psychologically trick them into thinking that they moved it. But just like he even said, I mean, this goes back to Wilder Penfield. I mean, way back in the day, they were talking about this, even before the invention of that technology he just mentioned before, is that you can stimulate the brain. You can literally open up someone's skull and you can like probe, with electrodes, parts of the brain, and they will move and talk and do other things and blah, blah, blah. And like, it's not voluntary. And they will even say, I didn't choose to do that. I don't believe I want to do it. You're just really treating them like a puppet. And at that point, like, I'm not really sure what this point is supposed to prove. That, oh, well, you can make people behave in certain ways. Sure. I mean, yeah, but that doesn't mean they're still not controlling their behavior or that they don't have a way to freely cause the way they move. Just because you can manipulate the way people behave, just because you can gaslight them and, make them think all sorts of things, I mean, that doesn't mean it's not happening. So I don't know, I just don't think that was that impressive of a point. This next one's a bit more technical, but I think it's important to make right here. Let's see here. We'll start here.
You then go to consciousness itself, where I was really pleased to say that, obviously I think it's right because it agrees with me, but that, consciousness is an epiphenomena. I love that where you point, which by the way, Noam Chomsky, you said to me in a different context, but he said, but where you say consciousness is an irrelevant hiccup.
Ugh, it's cringe.
Which I'm going to quote that over
It's
and over
fantastic.
again.
It's cringe. And see, the fact that the materialists find that is fantastic. That's very telling. So the first part I want to address here, epiphenomenalism. I want to make the distinction between mental causation and free will, because there is a difference. Just because a mind, let's assume there is no free will for sake of argument, just because a mind did not freely choose to cause something to happen, it doesn't follow, therefore, that the mind didn't cause it to happen. See? Like, it's not a contradiction. Having the ability to voluntarily do something, to freely cause something, that's one thing. But the ability to cause something, that's another. Epiphenomenalism is the view that the mind is an epiphenomenon. The mind, in this view, would be emergent from the brain, but it doesn't have any causal influences. And the problem with that is, even if you think there's no free will, you still need mental causation, because mental causation is still the best explanation for human behavior. And psychologists even talk about this. I've talked about this in other streams where without mental causation, we are left with less explanatory power. We are explanatorily impaired. Cognition is blind without this mental causation to guide the behavior. So, and the problem with that is, once you allow mental causation in the picture, now you have to make sense of it. And I think the only way you can make sense of mental causation is with idealism. I have a whole video called The Argument from Mental Causation, if you want to look into that. So I won't go on a rant about that. But I think that's going to be a big point that we can make against people who deny free will, is that even if there's no free will, you still need mental causation. And in order to make sense of mental causation, you're going to need a monistic ontology with irreducible consciousness, and then it's game over from them. Now you're left with idealism. So if you want more details on that, go check out my video on that. But yeah, I just think oh yeah, and this idea that consciousness is just an irrelevant hiccup, that's so cringe, dude. Like, if Chomsky really said that, that's really absurd for him to say that, of all people. because he argued against the behaviorists back in the day. Back in like the 50s, there were these psychologists called the behaviorists who thought, really, there is no consciousness. There's no mind, no thinking, no feelings, no internal subjective world. There's just behavior, which is, kind of what a lot of people are like today in the material and who are determinists. But Chomsky argued against that and helped revolutionize this new movement of cognitive science by saying, no, there has to be thoughts and feelings, and that's what helps drive our behavior. So for Chomsky to just be like, it's an irrelevant hiccup, if he really said that, it's just so ironic, because if it was so irrelevant and it's just a hiccup, what was all that fuss against the behaviorists then? So yeah, I think consciousness is far more than a hiccup. It's actually exhaustive of reality. And you're going to need it to make sense of human behavior. And you won't be able to do that without idealism. So yeah, it's definitely more than a hiccup. Yeah, that's such a, in psychology, we call that minimizing. That you could tell they know it's a problem, but they want to try to minimize and say, oh, it's just a little hiccup. It's just a speed bump. It's not a big deal. But that's denial, my friends. You know it's a big deal. All right. So this next one is also a little bit more technical, but definitely worth addressing. Right over there. I can never get exactly where I want to go. So
Evolution itself, in some sense, it seems to me, when I was reading it, some thoughts occurred, and I wanted to run them by you. I mean, it's no great mystery. I mean, snowflakes are in some sense emergent complexity. You take the fundamental polar interactions of molecules, and who would have thought they'd form these beautiful Christmas-like patterns? But more than that, evolution itself, in some sense, is because you point out that the whole point of emergent complexity is that the individual constituents are just doing their own little thing without knowing what the whole system is doing, and somehow the whole system goes in a certain direction. And that's a remarkable statement.
Yeah, and so the part I wanted to point out there was he noted about how with emergent complexity, like with a snowflake, for instance, that is something that is emergent. You have a bunch of complex interactions of smaller parts that come together to form this snowflake. Aha, there you go. And it's not that hard to reverse engineer when you have emergent complexity. You can work backwards and say, I have the snowflake, but let's analyze its constituent parts, work backwards, see how we get the snowflake from there. And it's not a big mystery, like he said, and that's true. But he wants to say that's the case for consciousness. And that's a big problem, because notice how he even said there seems to be this hard problem of consciousness. There's this issue of consciousness. And if consciousness was just this emergent phenomenon like a snowflake or something else, you should have no problem. It shouldn't be a mystery. Like he even said before, oh yeah, emergent complexity, it's not a big mystery. Well, then why is consciousness such a big mystery? It's kind of a contradiction there. If consciousness, I'm not saying anything that's emergent is somehow not a mystery, but if consciousness, which is this local phenomenon, it's what we know most intimately. It's not like some black hole that we can't access without crazy instrumentation. It's right here at home. Okay, if you can't work backwards with the neurons and the chemistry and all that stuff, I think that's a tell. That's a red flag. That's a sign that this isn't something that's just emergent. It's really easy to see how traffic or snowflake is just a bunch of smaller parts coming together. It's not like that for consciousness and neurons. I don't see, and most people don't see how, oh, it's just a bunch of neurons smashed together, firing and chemical reactions and stuff. It really, on its face, does not seem to be that way. Unlike traffic. Traffic looks like just a bunch of cars smashed together in a tight space on the highway. Snowflakes looks like just a bunch of these smaller particles kind of just together in a pattern. That's all she wrote. Consciousness, definitely not like that. So I think that's a mark against emergent complexity in the context of consciousness. Oh yeah, this next one's kind of funny. This is where they kind of diss Dennett a bit. And Daniel Dennett is an eliminativist, materialist philosopher, and he's a big compatibilist, which is pretty based. kind of surprising because he eliminates consciousness. So it's interesting that he even does that. But I think he also knows, he's even said before that Dennett, he knows the societal consequences of removing free will. So I think a part of it could be that he could be someone who maybe he agrees more with those who deny free will, and he just thinks it's bad for society. Or maybe he is just a genuine compatibilist. I don't know. But I have a hard time making sense of his compatibilism with his eliminativism. That just doesn't seem to go well. But let's see what they have to say.
There's an elephant in the room here, and it's Dan Dennett. And I do want to
calling Dennett fat.
I do want to mention that because it seems to me it demonstrates. I know Dan, and he's been a friend of mine for a long time, but it amazes me how someone who is remarkable in his arguments about many things can be so confused and illogical that somehow obvious nonsense like that. If he can be that confused and logical, it should make you suspicious about the rest of the field.
I don't think that should make you suspicious of the field. If anything, it should make you suspicious of Dennett, which I don't think it should per se. But it's just but if you see a problem with Dennett's reasoning, remember Dennett is a minority in the philosophy of mind. He's an eliminativist, and a lot of people find that to be incredibly counterintuitive and even insane. Strawson calls it the great silliness, and he has like a whole article just dabbing on Dennett about that. So, I mean, quite frankly, I think that should have been your first red flag. If you were listening to Dennett and you were hearing him trying to eliminate consciousness, and if you weren't already like, wow, that's pretty crazy, dude. And then you hear him say this about free will, and you're like, whoa, 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 now it's crazy. It's like, where were you before? I mean, did you not hear him trying to eliminate consciousness? I mean, that was already a tell that this may not be the greatest philosopher of all time. But so yeah, this isn't a problem with philosophy of mind or anything like that. It's, I would say, and I don't think Dennett's even wrong. I'm actually supporting Dennett with the compatibilism. I think Dennett makes good points about compatibilism. But if you're going to argue that, oh, he's ridiculous because he disagrees with me about free will, then just wait till you hear what he has to say about consciousness. So, and I think there's another one where they diss Dennett again. They kind of pick on Dennett a bit here. Let's see, right about there, close enough.
Intent, which was earlier, isn't biologically determined. It's that irrationality. You do give to pick again on dead horse. You pick on Dan Dennett a lot. But basically he says that. He says, so when he argued with someone that we have no control over the biology or the environment thrown at us, Dennett's response was, so what? The point I think you're missing is that our autonomy is something one grows into. It's a process that's initially entirely beyond one's control. But back when it was happening, it was the same biology, so it wasn't anymore. And as one matures, one learns, one's being able to control more and more of one's activities. But the whole point is, you just learned that you don't control. I mean, you don't control them. You control them, but your control over that was determined.
That's so funny. Well, you don't control them. Okay, you do control them, but that's determined. And it's like, well, which is it? I'm not quite sure. I like Dennett's attitude there. It's like, yeah, okay, we don't control like the cards that are dealt to me. If I'm playing, blackjack, I don't control. I don't choose the cards I get, but from there I can choose. From there I have control. I don't have total free libertarian will, where I can just do anything like spontaneously, no prior causes. People who believe in free will don't believe in that. See, a big part of the problem is they have this I'm not trying to say they're straw manning in the sense that it's deliberate, but there is a straw man position here about the way they look at free will. They think, oh, free will's got to be this uncaused cause. It's got to be this fairy stuff. It's got to be dualistic and it's beyond science. And it's just like, well, yeah, if you pigeonhole those who believe in free will like that, I mean, sure, but I mean, you're talking about Daniel Dennett here. He doesn't believe in no fairy stuff. He doesn't see it that way. How does he make sense of free will in general? I got to read more of his stuff, I guess, because he eliminates consciousness, so I kind of have a hard time of how he makes sense of it. But But the logic behind compatibilism, the defense of compatibilism, it holds water. I'm not seeing how they've done a good enough job. Well, you didn't control the cards you were dealt. Okay, well, I still have control. It's like, okay, you have control, but you don't have control of your control. It's just like, I don't know. So grow into your autonomy by using your autonomy to realize you have autonomy. That's what this guy was saying. It's almost like I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude. No, I think we got a good point to make there. So, all right, so that's them making fun of Dennett, them dabbing on him. I think I got one more timestamp for you guys. Let's go ahead and check this out. There we go. I think this is kind of ironic when he says this, Krauss in particular. I know I should have been addressing Sapolsky more, but it feels like Krauss ended up saying a lot of what needed to be said in general. But I don't know. Let's see.
Once again, if Hume had been around today, he would say that reason is a slave of passion. It's
Yeah.
I mean, this gives meat to that beautiful quote. Which he presumed, I guess, on the basis of thinking about things, but not with the evidence that you have. And it's great to see evidence that specifically shows over and over again that reason is a slave of passion.
I don't think he realizes the irony of that. It's like, reason, it's a slave to passion. And we have good reasons to believe that. But wait, reason is a slave to passion. Do you see? Like, if reason, if you really believe that, if you think whenever I give rational arguments and provide evidence for something, really, it's like a kind of a cope. Really, it's a kind of, I'm just telling you how I feel and I'm trying to rationalize it. If that's genuinely what you believe about human reason and evidence, when you come back with this, hey guys, look, I got scientific evidence that this is real. Do you see the problem there? Like, by your own admission, oh, you're just coping. You're just trying to psychologically, reaffirm yourself and rationalize your beliefs that we shouldn't be responsible for our behavior. So I don't think Krauss is realizing the irony of that. So I don't know. I just thought that was kind of funny. But, I guess that's about it for the video there. So that's Sapolsky and Krauss. All right. There we go. So not very impressed. Sapolsky is a scientist, so that's not a big surprise. Einstein himself says the man of science is a poor philosopher. And really, I wasn't seeing anything new. I didn't show you the whole 3-hour video because it's 3 hours, but I listened to that video, that whole talk, and other things said by Sapolsky. And quite frankly, he's not saying anything new. He's not saying anything that detractors of free will haven't already said before. He's just sort of reaffirming the scientism and materialism that grounds their denial of free will. But once you refute the materialism and the scientism, then you really don't have a reason to doubt your prima facie belief that you have free will. Do you see? You already, just right away, it's very natural to believe in free will. And until you have a good reason to actually doubt it, then go ahead. Okay, then doubt it. But if you don't have a good reason, then you should just stick with what seems to be true. So I guess that's my point there. Don't let these materialists gaslight you, bros. So now I'm going to address the chat a little bit. See what we got from you guys. So Freedom Sherpa asks, do you think that the fact that blind people see things that we experience in the material world during NDEs and DMT trips is a good counter to needing experiences to be self-aware of other stuff? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but let me see this here. No. Perhaps so. I don't think you need experiences to be self-aware. No, like you have to have sensory experiences to know that there's a self or an I. I'm not seeing any reason to believe that. But yeah, I think the fact that you can, if you're blind and you can still see, you can still experience, then yeah, I mean, then even if you do believe that, well, then guess what? They can become self-aware because they are having experiences. So I guess you could say that is a good way to do that. And he made another comment here saying, free will deniers trying to use experiments to make a conclusion. when they had no free will to set up the experiments or determine it is true. Well played. Like, how do you establish a good epistemological foundation for finding out what is true or false without free will to accept something as true or false? I get the point there. I'm not sure if I fully agree with it because some people, there's doxastic voluntarism and involuntarism where they say you're free to to make a belief or something like that. And there's a big back and forth on that. And I get the point. When people say you can't really choose your beliefs, I get it. Like, I'm an idealist not because I'm like choosing to be an idealist. I feel like the evidence does compel me. But at the same time, I feel like it's possible to gaslight yourself. It's possible to talk yourself out of things. It's possible to like have a belief and then you overwrite it and you go, you know what? I don't know. This belief it's if I believe in free will, like now I have responsibility and I can't deal with that. So I'm gonna talk myself out of free will. So maybe there is a sense in which that happens, um but yeah, I'm not sure if I think like, oh, without free will, you don't have an epistemological foundation. I'm not entirely sure I believe that. But I see the point there. I see what you're getting at. Okay. These guys just take self-defeating to its absolute. I agree. Especially with that last one, right? It's just a reason, it's just a slave to passion. Here are my reasons for believing that. And I agree with this guy. James the Wise says, no real empiricist is a physicalist. I agree. Some of the OG empiricists like George Berkeley and even Hume were not physicalists. They were very much idealists. And I mean, if you're just sticking with experience, and if you think matter is somehow beyond experience, then yeah, why on earth would you be a physicalist? Really, I don't get it. And then James the Wise also says again, so these scientists who presuppose physicalism should be taken seriously whenever they talk metaphysics. Suppose. So these scientists who presuppose should be taken seriously. I guess. Yeah, I mean we should still take them seriously when they talk, but yeah. And then we have here Yassine. You have a choice. Cope or seethe. That's right. If you deny free will, if you're saying, I don't have a choice, yes, you do. You can cope or you can seethe. Oh, he said, I meant you shouldn't. Oh, so that you shouldn't take them seriously. These scientists who presuppose should not be taken seriously when they talk metaphysics. I can get behind that. I don't want to be uncharitable and write people off, but I mean, even Einstein is like the man of science. He's just not a good philosopher. And especially if you're not thinking through your physicalism, you're just imposing this scientism and materialism onto your view instead of actually thinking it through, then yeah, that's not a well thought out metaphysician. That's not someone who's really done the work that's needed. They can wear their lab coat all they want, but that just doesn't address what's necessary. You need to be a metaphysician, not a physician. And James the Wise has another comment here. He says, we got to educate the average person on metaphysics. Most people think it's either religious fundamentalism or nihilistic physicalism. I agree. I completely agree. I think we need to teach the average person, everybody, logic and critical thinking. We all get taught math, English, and science growing up. I think logic and critical thinking, and I think absolutely metaphysics should be a part of that because, I mean, metaphysics is ubiquitous. We're always doing it. We all have these beliefs about what we think is real. There's science, which, gets into how things behave, but we believe that there are entities that behave. And what are those entities? That's what metaphysics does. And if we're going to do metaphysics, we might as well do it right. We might as well do it well. We might as well learn how to do it. So, I don't know. It only makes sense to me. But thanks all you guys for your great comments and your questions. Thanks for watching. I guess that's about it for tonight on this one. Next week, I believe, is Thanksgiving. So I'm not going to be doing a show next week. But the week after that, yeah, I'll have another one for you guys. So go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification thing so you know when I'm going to go live. Usually I've been going live on Thursdays. That seems to be the schedule. I haven't made it official, but it seems like Thursdays. So keep an eye out for Thursdays. Subscribe, just so you know when I'm going live. And yeah, thanks again for watching. Peace out, everybody.